Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second webinar for grade K through 5 teachers in our 2021-2022 series entitled Building Student Visual Literacy for a Diverse Image-Saturated World. I'm Darcy Beeman Black, and I'll be your host today. Each webinar in this series delves deeper into topics around building skills with students to help them navigate the image-saturated world through reading, discussing, researching, and making images. Today's webinar focuses on how to talk about art. Our previous webinar focused on how to read art, and I invite you all to check it out on the Getty YouTube channel for teachers if you wish to get an introduction to looking at and interpreting works of art. Also, I would like to note that while our focus in the series is on images of works of art in the Getty Museum collection, our goal is for you to be able to apply these same concepts to all different kinds of images that will span well beyond our collection. We also hope to inspire you to incorporate works of art into your teaching across subject areas by showing you how easy it is to connect them to your curriculum. So let's get into that topic. So why are we talking about this? As museum educators, we have broad experience facilitating conversations about art featured in our galleries. We have seen the value of sharing and responding to ideas inspired by a work of art and how discussions can uncover great learning moments for students. So what can students learn from having discussions? Through discussions, students can challenge assumptions and practice learning from each other. They can try out different perspectives they may have not considered previously, while also expressing their own opinions and viewpoints. Students can also practice listening and showing respect for others and learn to separate ideas from the people who hold them and practice dealing with disagreement. Many of us know how important these skills can be for a healthy community. There is also value in experiencing group thinking. Students can learn that diversity of peers and variation of ideas can be a resource and can experience solving problems as a group. We've also found that talking about art increases complex thinking and builds the language needed to express that thinking. Talking about what you see in front of you also builds ideas using a visual language. Trying to match words to what you think about and what you see and what drives you to seek out more words and explain your ideas. Talking about art also increases interest in writing and helps students to make detailed observations while backing those observations up with evidence. And because students are able to see and hear other students' ideas backed up with evidence, it makes them more open to other interpretations and perspectives. So I also pulled these bullet points from the English Language Arts Common Core standards. These standards provide a foundation for learning for students by offering opportunities to take part in a variety of rich, structured conversations about a variety of media formats, as a whole class, in small groups, or with a partner. There is also a focus on evaluation and use of evidence. So you'll find that throughout our presentation today, these standards present themselves in a variety of ways, and that you can easily incorporate some of these approaches to fit your curriculum goals. And then I also wanted to share, if you were able to watch our last webinar, you are familiar with this blueprint for how to read an image. If you were unable to catch it, again, I encourage you to check it out on the Getty YouTube channel. But I wanted to point out that discussions can happen in any stage of this process. They can be had when you're taking inventory, identifying a story in an image. But today you might find that we're sticking around in step 3, the synthesis stage. This is where comparison, sharing, listening, connecting, and combining observations appears the most to draw conclusions about a message of a work of art. So now that I've gone over the benefits of discussing art with students, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Rebecca, who's going to delve into the characteristics of a productive discussion.
Thanks, Darcy. Before we really get started talking about how specifically to organize and approach discussions with works of art, we thought it would be useful to talk a little bit about what makes for a good discussion. And everybody already has some idea about this, but I think it's helpful to think about the specific characteristics as you're reflecting on discussions that you're having in your classroom. So we went ahead and pulled together some what we consider things that are important to think about as you're conducting your discussions and evaluating how they're going. So you'll note that at the bottom of this slide, I've included a reference to the Teacher's Guide to Leading Student-Centered Discussions. This book is really geared, it's written more for teachers of maybe middle school, mostly high school and college level classrooms. And so even though we found certain aspects of it really useful, we didn't choose it as the giveaway book for this webinar because of that. That said, there are a lot of great ideas in there, some of which we'll be sharing today, as well as some diagrams from that book, which we think help to summarize how to think about having a good conversation. So first off, safety, and I'll talk more about each of these four things. Secondly, having an appropriate challenge level for your discussion is really key to having it be productive and having students engage. Ensuring that there's authentic participation from students, and thinking about where you are as a teacher on the student-led versus teacher-led continuum of discussions. And that may also depend on where your students are and what they're ready for. So let's talk a little bit about safety first. So here's one of those diagrams from the Hale and City book that I was referring to. What does a safe discussion environment look like? Looks like an environment where most of the students are comfortable participating, where they're listening to each other, where they're treating each other with respect, where there aren't side conversations happening. So this diagram kind of shows for you what it might be like if there's not enough safety, or if people are feeling so safe that they might not be behaving very well on the attacking personality side. So what can we do to help make sure that the environment for discussion is safe? One thing that's really helpful is to establish ground rules and post them somewhere in your classroom. And I'll share with you in a few slides a sample list that you can use. I think it's also really helpful when your students are a little older. So this might be the grades 3 through 5, as opposed to the kindergarten and first and second grade students. I think it's really helpful to have a conversation with students about what makes for a good discussion so that you can get buy-in and so that they more naturally understand what's going to be helpful for the class. Certainly, you can provide and model multiple ways that students can participate in discussions. I'm sure you all do this already, but highlighting exactly what those things are, like you can ask a question in a discussion, you can share some of your own ideas, you can point out observations. Other things that aren't on the slide, you can comment on what one of your peers said. You can wonder about something without having an answer or exactly a question. Similarly, you can, and I'm also sure you do this, you can adapt your approaches to your students. So you can do large group discussions, small group, pair share, and mix them up. It's also important to think about the cultural differences between your students and incorporate teaching strategies that are responsive to those. Many of you have likely read the Zaretta Hammond book about culturally responsive teaching, and I think that overviews some of these ideas really well and gets deeper into many of them. So for example, some students might be more comfortable being more individualistic in how they think about and develop their ideas. Other students might be more comfortable collectively working on developing their ideas. So creating opportunities where both of those things can happen supports the success of a diversity of students. Similarly, it's always helpful to draw connections between what you're going to be looking at and students' prior experiences. You can also invite community involvement. So for example, you might, leading up to the discussion that you're going to have in class, maybe the day before or the evening before, invite students to take the image home or post it on their Google Classroom and to show it to somebody in their family and see what their family thinks about it. One of their family members thinks about it. And of course, build the discussions around what you know are the areas of strength for your students. So the other thing that helps to support a safe discussion environment is to think about your role as a teacher. And I found when I work with students in our museum galleries that I have a hard time deciding about some of these things. I try one, I try the other, and can't definitively decide which one I prefer. So I point them out because I don't think there's just one way of doing it, but I think it's important to think about what way you're doing it. So for example, think about how your body language is impacting students feeling successful in a discussion. Are you following each speaker with your eyes, or perhaps maybe you're just looking down at your paper and taking notes or looking at the image that you're discussing? Sometimes there's the risk of kind of unconsciously looking more or differently at different students. And one way of kind of removing that kind of subtle feedback that could come across as not as inclusive as you want it to be is to think about what you're doing with your body. Maybe not directly looking is one solution. Depends on what level of encouragement your students will need. Also, this is one I really struggle with, is thinking about the role of positive feedback. So I so often, after a student speaks, want to reinforce it and tell them what a great idea it was. And sometimes I worry that if I remember to do that sometimes and don't remember to do it other times, that might subtly make some students feel more included than others. So sometimes I've just decided I'm not going to do that at all, so that there's a balance in the experience for all the students. The other thing is it's okay to have a little bit of silence, and sometimes that silence creates opportunities for students who might be more hesitant at the beginning to feel more comfortable to jump in. So here's that thing I said I would share, which is a list of sample ground rules for classroom discussions. Listening without interrupting, respecting your peers. Important is to disagree with ideas and not people. So, right, you don't have to agree with things that somebody else is saying, but that doesn't mean you don't agree with the person. So highlighting the difference between ideas and people is really important to make the environment feel safe. Certainly no teasing and making fun of others. Oops, I'm sorry. And not having distracting conversations, making sure everybody has a chance to speak, making sure that when a student contributes that they're staying on topic and not talking about Pokemon or whatever it is that they're interested in at the moment. So all of those suggestions to me fall under the category of creating a safe discussion environment in your classroom. Now let's talk a little bit about creating an appropriate challenge level. So a discussion is not going to go as well if it's too hard or too easy. So a lot of it is about finding what your sweet spot is going to be to make the discussion go well. And this is supported by what works of art you choose to discuss. So we spent a lot of time thinking about, well, what makes an image that will be good for a good discussion, that's going to create a rich, deep discussion that students have a lot to say about. So we came up with this list, and we don't think that every item on this list needs to be concurrently part of a single work of art that you're discussing. We think that every work of art needs to have some of these characteristics. So I'll go through them a little bit, and then I'm going to pull up some examples to give you an idea of how it might play out as you're selecting an image. So obviously should have an appropriate level of complexity for your students. So it shouldn't be an image that's like so obvious that they look at it and they don't feel like there's anything more to wonder about. Actually, though, oftentimes there is more to wonder about, but having something that's more openly curiosity evoking is helpful. Images that have big ideas or values embedded in them, that with analysis of what you're looking at can bring you to bigger ideas. Those kinds of images lead to great conversations. Works of art that have lots of details and clues that tell you more about what they're about and what the artist wanted to share. Those are really great to use. Sometimes an image that has ambiguity makes for a great discussion. Similarly, works of art that have aspects of them that are connecting for students that they look at and they can make sense of, but which also have certain aspects that are unusual or unfamiliar. The juxtaposition of those can also create a great discussion. Certainly looking for works of art that will be connecting to or interesting to students might be helpful for you if they connect to other things that you're doing in your class around that time. Works of art that have layered narratives also lead to a lot of great conversations. Works of art that are intriguing, that really make you wonder, but not so much that you just decide you can't make sense of it at all. And certainly, especially if you're trying to create conversations that support students' social emotional learning and their awareness of diversity, picking works of art from other times and places and cultures can be really helpful for that. Okay, so here's one example. So here's an image, a work of art that tells the story of Hercules and battling the Hydra. So what are some elements of this from that list that I was just sharing that would help to make it a good topic for discussion? So it likely has both new and familiar content, and also things that are unknown to the student on first look. So, right, there's those heads that certainly look like snakes, but it also doesn't quite look like a snake because it's got all of those heads. There are, even Hercules, for students who are familiar with Hercules, they might be able to recognize him in his club, but he's also depicted in a way that we don't normally see. So it might take some wondering and some looking to figure out who that might be. This vase has lots of details and clues that can help to uncover the story that's here. It represents a narrative that some students, especially in the upper elementary grades, are likely becoming familiar with, and which is also likely of interest to some students who have been following mythology. Here's another example. So this is a self-portrait by photographer Lewis Hine. And on first look, there's some familiar things, like there's a young person in the photograph who, in some ways looks like young people today. But on the other hand, his clothing looks different. And I'm not sure that students today necessarily know what a newsboy is. So they might have heard of newspapers, but they maybe haven't seen newspapers that look like that. So it has a nice balance of both new and familiar content. It also takes us to another time and place and asks us to put ourselves in the shoes of this person who lived at a different time from us and to wonder about what's going on with that person. This also is great to connect to curriculum if you're doing, for example, social studies curriculum and learning about people in your neighborhood, for example. Although they may not be familiar with newsboys, there still are newspaper delivery people that are members of our community who contribute to our day-to-day lives. And the first point here about how this image communicates big ideas and values So this photographer, Louis Hine, was very interested in issues of child labor, and a lot of his photography was taken to bring out issues around the unfairness of child labor. And if you look closely at this image, you may start to also, even a student can begin to wonder about, why is this kid on the street with this pile of papers and not at school or not playing with his friends? So even if the viewer or the student is not familiar with Louis Hine's work, some of those topics can come out with exploration of this photograph. Here's another one, a Dorothea Lange photograph of students saying the Pledge of Allegiance. Darcy and I were also wondering how many classrooms say the Pledge of Allegiance these days. So depending on where you are and what you do in your classroom, your students may or may not be familiar with this. It talks about big values issues and how people participate in their country. Has lots of clues. The expressions have so much to tell you about what's going on here. There's an intrigue level. If you look at some of these faces in the photograph that are very scrunched up, it causes one to wonder, okay, what's going on? Why are their faces scrunched up? And it can lead to a really rich conversation about, some of the students look like they're in the sun, some look like they're in the shade. Why are they looking up? And so this conversation, this image can bring about a lively discussion for those reasons. All right, here's another one. Similarly, there's certainly some ambiguity here. There's a big fish, it's a whale, but it doesn't necessarily look like the whales that we see on the National Geographic Channel. And there's a story. So there's a lot to wonder about here that students can uncover as they look closer. Here's another one, a sculpture by Messerschmitt of a man with a very unusual expression. I've certainly engaged with students in pretty vibrant debates about what is that expression and what is he doing and why is he making that face and what's going on in his mind while he's making that face. So those are some examples of selecting works of art that can be contribute to a lively conversation. Not all works of art equally create lively conversations, so the selection process is important. Similarly, in order to adjust the challenge level to be in the just right zone, it's important to think about your questions. And I really encourage deliberate question asking with works of art. It often is easy to just kind of ask questions off the cuff that don't lead to as good of a discussion. So it's helpful to think about questions that are grounded in the work of art, that are open-ended, that allow for a lot of different perspectives to come out, that generate more questions and create more wondering. And I always try asking myself a question and seeing how I would answer it and how many answers I can come up with to get a sense of whether I think it's going to spark a good conversation or not. So then authentic participation. So this is an element of a conversation where we're thinking about whether students can engage honestly. Are they saying what they think you want to hear, or are they actually engaging with the image and sharing ideas? So as your discussions are unfolding in your classroom, it's helpful to think about what kinds of comments students are making as well, and whether they reflect authentic participation. Lastly, I think it's helpful to think about how much of a facilitator you're going to be as a teacher, and how much empowerment you're going to give to your students in leading the conversation themselves. And that will be really dependent on your students' comfort level and may change as you have discussions about art. And as they become more experienced. But one way or the other, it's helpful to be deliberate about how you're going to carry out your role when you're leading a discussion as well. Okay, So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to share about 4 different approaches that are very concrete. So far we've been talking broadly about what good discussions should look like. Now we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit more about specific types of strategies you can use to develop good discussions in your classroom as you're focusing on works of art. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Darcy for a little while.
Thank you, Rebecca. All right, hello everyone again. So I'm just going to jump right into the first approach. So the first approach we're going to share is a popular one. You may or may not have heard about it before, and it uses a very specific protocol to facilitate discussions about what students see in a work of art. The primary objective calls for students to look carefully at a work of art and discuss what they observe. I will share this approach using this drawing from the Getty collection called An Enchanted Cellar with Animals. The drawing depicts a Dutch kitchen from the 17th century, and it's filled with animals that I think all look like they're up to something. And I've discussed this drawing with students before and gotten some really interesting ideas. So visual thinking strategies, or VTS, is what you might hear me say throughout this presentation, but it basically functions on the use of 3 questions to help students think through their ideas. The 3 questions include, what is happening here? So after a few minutes of looking at the image, you would pose this question to students, and then their responses would drive the direction of the discussion. So for example, a student may answer with, there's a monkey in a shirt trying to escape. Or another answer might be, there is a man discovering the animals got loose in this room. And if you all see that, there's a monkey in the foreground next to a column, and then there's a man looking behind a curtain walking in. And then once the student shares that idea, you could pose another question. And that question could be, what do you see that makes you think that? And then the student has to back up their statement at this point with what they see. So perhaps the student that pointed out the monkey is trying to escape, they might say, I see a chain connected to the pole and the monkey. And then we could dig even deeper into this assumption and pose another question to the group or to the student. And that question would be, what more can we find? And someone else might add that the monkey is holding the chain in a fashion that makes it look like they're trying to escape. So maybe he's pulling it, trying to get away. And you would then open it up again and invite more thoughts and ideas. And you would use these 3 questions interchangeably to drive the conversation. So then there's also tips that the VTS protocol offers. And one rule that is encouraged is that you physically point to the observations made by the students. So Rebecca mentioned earlier, body language during discussion, like, are you looking down? Are you looking up? Are you looking at the students while they're talking? Well, this one really encourages you to physically point to the observation so that everyone can see it. This verifies that you're understanding what they're saying, and that also other students can understand and see what the student is observing. And then it also makes sure that the student feels heard. Another tip is to verbally rephrase the observations of the students. So this not only verifies that you're understanding what the student is saying, but then it also shares out the idea to everyone else. And then another job during these use of questions, these 3 questions, and then discussing in between, is that you're going to link student ideas together. For example, maybe after this discussion about the monkey chained up, another student points out the owl facing the monkey in front and how it looks like the owl is talking to the monkey. And then when you ask another question, you would learn that maybe the student thinks that because the owl is the owl might be perhaps like getting the monkey to escape and helping the monkey. And then lastly, remain neutral and treat all comments the same. So even when you think a student is wrong, so maybe they say something that just seems like, I don't know, help them think through that reasoning rather than tell them they're wrong. So just, again, like, why do you think that? Go back to that question. And I do want to say there is a ton more to add regarding visual thinking strategies, but these basics are really easy to pick up, and you could really do it with any image, and just practice using those 3 questions with students. All right, so the next approach emphasizes the process of uncovering multiple perspectives as a way to drive discussions with students. So the objective for this approach is to bring awareness to diversity of ideas and practice listening to and respecting others' opinions. So to demonstrate this approach, I'm going to use this image. It is a drinking cup from ancient Greece, and it features 3 figures: Pegasus, a chimera, and a hero called Bellerophon. And for step 1, what you would do is, as a group, you would take inventory of all of the viewpoints that you could find. And we're going to answer this question, who is the hero? And that's going to sort of drive, and why do you think that? And that's going to drive this activity. So what you would do is you could put this up on the board or hand out a graphic organizer that basically has a list of why you as a group think that each character might be the hero. And you could invite students to offer their ideas for which one they think, and then you record those answers. So I'm going to go through some of these with you, with the work of art that might come up that I've had students bring up with me. So for Pegasus, if we mine answers from the group on why Pegasus might be the hero, we can list out some of these possibilities that I've heard. So one is that Pegasus is the tallest out of all of them. Pegasus, his front legs are around the neck of the chimera. And then maybe the person is helping Pegasus win by supporting him from underneath. So since Pegasus is being supported underneath, that makes his chances better. Another option would be, or another reason might be, Pegasus can use the wings that he has to fly away. He has an advantage over the other 2 figures because he can fly. And then if we look at Bellerophon, he might be the hero because he's the one actually stabbing the creature. And, he's also holding the strap of Pegasus above. And then if you see where the spear is stabbing the chimera, you can see there's maybe some evidence of blood there. So maybe that signifies that he's the one who's really calling the shots in this battle. And then also maybe he's the most clever because he's underneath. And then the chimera, maybe because they have 3 heads. Maybe that makes them have the advantage and they're the hero. And then maybe because they're still standing, even though they've gotten stabbed, they don't look like they're falling down. They still look like they're in the fight. So maybe they're still winning. Maybe there's an advantage that the creature has because it has 3 different heads, and they could be, deciding and plotting and figuring out a way to win the battle. And then the creature also, maybe where we see the spear hitting the chest, maybe those little triangular wavy things, maybe that's protection. Maybe there's actually some sort of chest piece keeping it safe. So those are some of the ideas that I've heard from students about each one. So once you would get a good list in the graphic organizer or, on the board or something like that. And then it's time to guide students through considering the reasoning of their peers and asking questions about their opinions. So a question like, which point of view do you agree with and why, can be a good jumping off point. And then you could start asking for different or similar opinions and work through their reasoning by asking why. At this stage, it's also important to stay away from language like, do we all agree? Because you'll get a bunch of yeses or a bunch of no's, and then that's sort of a discussion stopper, and it kind of causes like bandwagon effect. And then, there may be students that really disagree or agree strongly. So you can help manage the students' agreements and disagreements by using sentence stems. So things like, I respectfully disagree because, or I agree with you because, or I see what you're saying, but. So that can sort of take away maybe some anxiety that students might have about showing some disagreement. And so now I'm going to pass it back over to Rebecca, and Rebecca is going to share a few more approaches before we're done today.
Thanks, Darcy. And we should point out that while we're sharing a handful of different approaches, there's a lot of overlap between these approaches, and ultimately they can be used together. We found it useful to call out specific focuses in what you're doing, because it's a lot for students to do all of it at one time when they're new to having these kinds of discussions. So it's helpful to have a different focus in different discussions and help students learn how to use that kind of focus in a discussion before you start stacking these approaches. So while visual thinking strategy and the multiple perspective focus that Darcy just shared certainly rely on using supporting evidence, they don't make that a focus of how the discussion is constructed. So another type of discussion that you can have that's useful as a skill building experience for students, in not just in looking at art, but when they're reading literature or discussing other kinds of texts, they are beginning to learn about how to use evidence to support their ideas and opinions. So it's a really helpful approach to use, not just for art. So this approach is focused on helping students to learn how to build ideas that are evidence-based. And we're going to use this Lewis Hine image again to explore that. So to get started, and this will also vary depending on the experience level of your students. For students who are new to this, it's really helpful to just start out by talking about what do we mean by supporting evidence? What is it? What are examples of supporting evidence? And to create a classroom culture, not just when you're looking at art, in which supporting evidence is asked for regularly in conversations. So some of the strategies that, especially visual thinking strategies, is a kind of a baseline for looking for evidence, because it starts by asking, what do you notice? And then asks for more details to support that. But certainly you can just practice identifying evidence. So you can start, for example, here's a practice activity you could do. You could start by selecting a question that connects to the work of art that you've chosen to look at. For example, it might be, how might this newsboy answer the question, are you enjoying selling newspapers? So, I haven't made it a simple question. It's a question that you can look for a lot of details to formulate an answer for, and that's on purpose. Then you can identify possible points of view. So in this case, it's not too complicated. Probably you either think that the boy would say that he enjoys selling newspapers, or you'd say that he probably would say that he doesn't enjoy it. Then you can ask students, and you can do this in small groups. For younger students, you can do it as a big group, and the teacher can be a note taker. In smaller groups, you can ask students to together note take or use a visual organizer. in groups or in teams. So then you can ask them to find evidence to support each point of view. And they can also talk about whether it's hard to find evidence to support the different points of view they've identified. And what's also useful about this exercise is that it helps to build a kind of a tolerance for points of view that are not your own. And that makes it easier to listen to other people and to be respectful and understand that not everybody is going to agree, but you can still get along and be friends and express your points of view. So it creates a more kind of structured way to explore that. So here we like graphic organizers a lot. Here's an example of a graphic organizer you could do in leading a whole group, or you could ask students to do a simpler version in smaller groups or on their own if they're closer to 5th grade, where it's a simple chart and the points of view are on the top. And then they look for evidence to support different points, the two different points of view in this case. So for example, what are some details that might tell us that he does enjoy it? Well, you could argue his clothes seem nice, perhaps. Maybe he likes doing a job so he can have nice clothes, earn money to have nice clothes. Or, gosh, it looks like a really nice day. I'd like to be on that street corner. Maybe it's nice to be outside and enjoying yourself on a sunny day. You could also look for pieces of evidence or details in the image that support that the boy might say that he's not enjoying it. You could zoom in on the expression on his face and notice that it's kind of serious. He doesn't really look happy. It's hard to read. It almost looks like he's bored. You know, some students might say, well, he's all by himself. That seems kind of lonely. Or they might say, gosh, those things that he's carrying look awkward and it doesn't look like it's nice to stand out on a street corner holding on to that. So then once you've familiarized students with looking at works of art and focusing on supporting evidence for their ideas, then you can also model some sentence stems for them to use to talk about these things. So for example, I think he looks bored because I see his expression on his face looks bored, like he's bored. Or I agree with the person sitting next to me that he's bored because he also just has a kind of a stiff, a bored stance. It doesn't look like he's playing or doing anything interesting. Or I see a shadow on the pavement, which shows that it's a sunny day. So those are some examples of how those sentence stems can be used. You might choose just one for younger students to practice using. But what's important about these particular sentence stems is they build in the need to provide a supporting detail to support your idea. The other thing you can do to build a culture of discussion that focuses on supporting evidence is to talk about different kinds of comments that somebody might use in a conversation. Comments that express an opinion, comments that are agreeing or disagreeing comments, comments that build on what somebody else has already said, wondering comments, clarifying comments. So that also can help student participation because it helps them to think about what are the kinds of things I could be saying about this work of art. And for each of these, you can practice them with your class. So that's one approach, one additional approach. The last one is relatively straightforward, which is about using listening skills to connect your ideas with other people in your class. And asking students to really focus on this connecting piece. And this builds skills in listening to what others are saying and in staying connected to the conversation that's happening. So while students are likely connecting to their peers anyhow, this activity asks them to be very focused on doing that and to really have to listen and to build that as a conversational skill. So And I find that this is an approach that works well for talkative classes because it makes it a little harder to say something because you have to think of how you're going to connect to what else you've heard. So there's an easier way and a harder way to do this. You can create a parameter in the discussion where in order, except for the first student, in order for a student to participate in the discussion, they have to build on something that a previous student has already said. So there's two ways of doing it. One is that they have to connect to the immediately previous comment. In some ways, that's easier from an executive function point of view because you don't have to remember so many different things. Or you can allow students to connect or comment to anything that's been said previously during the discussion. They just have to point out who said it so that they're demonstrating their listening skills. So you can build a whole conversation using this strategy. So here's an example. I just got it started so you could see how it might play out. So here's a question about these students saying the Pledge of Allegiance. The question is, what might these students be thinking? So the first person might say, I think they look focused on something. Some girls are looking upwards. The next person might say, I agree, some are looking upwards, but some look uncomfortable. Look at that girl who's squinting. And then the next one has to comment on that. So yes, that's true. One girl is squinting, but the girl in front isn't. I wonder if she's standing in a more comfortable spot with less sun. And as you look at these comments, you see that details about the work of art are slowly coming out in this process, as well as an analysis of what's going on. You can also use sentence stems for this. I love sentence stems. I think they equalize the playing field and help students who are more or less comfortable have an easier time articulating their ideas. So here are some examples of connecting sentence stems, like adding to what the person next to me said. I think it looks like it's sunny. Or in contrast to what the person next to me said, I wonder if they think it's hard to say the Pledge of Allegiance. So those are some examples, and you can imagine how that might play out. Okay, so last but not least, we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of troubleshooting, or how to make conversations better, how to make your discussions better. So here are some of the kinds of things that could come up, especially in cases where this is new, not something that you do a lot in your classroom and students are just getting used to it. So one is, what if students aren't feeling safe? So we've already talked a lot about how can you try and make it more safe. Here are some of the considerations you might have, right? What's the tone of the classroom? What's the comfort level? One of the more uncomfortable things about discussions is that what you say might be challenged by one of your classmates. So cultivating this idea that it's ideas that are being disagreed with, not people that are being disagreed with, are really helpful in building that kind of comfort and cultivate a more healthy thought process for students around what it means to discuss something. And then asking about whether the discussion is accessible to a lot of different types of learners. Is it at the right challenge level? Are there different ways that different students can participate? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And does the classroom environment allow for students to participate in different ways, right? If you're a question asker, will it allow for you to ask questions? If you're somebody who just likes to share observations, will it allow for you to do that? Similarly, say you have a started discussion and it's just not getting started. I think there might have been a comment about this in the Q&A in the chat. Like, what if you ask a question and there's just dead silence? So it's a process, creating a culture of discussion in your classroom. There are ways to get a conversation off the ground that make it a little bit easier. So certainly you don't want to start with a really challenging question, right? You want to start with simpler questions, icebreaker type questions. And you can use approaches like a round robin, using a question that's very easy to answer or that will be easy for your students. So these sample questions may not all be easy for your particular students, but come up with a question that would be easy for them. And then give everybody a chance to just provide a brief answer, and not to provide an explanation. This is not where supporting evidence comes in, but to just simply say something to kind of get the ball rolling. So some icebreaker type questions about a work of art might be, what's one detail that you noticed? So there's lots of things to see. It's not necessarily so challenging to say, I see something red, or I see a bird, or there's a person in this, or gosh, it's a black and white image, whatever it might be. So that's a way to get a lot of details out to jumpstart the conversation. You could ask, what do you think is the most important detail? That's a little bit more challenging. You could ask, this is something that as museum educators tends to come up a lot in our gallery-based teaching, is to ask, like, do you like this? Or would you put it in your home somewhere? Or would you put it in your bedroom? Is it something you would want to look at every day? So most students will have an opinion about whether they like it or not. Or if you had to rename it, what title would you give it? Something kind of fun and creative that there's no wrong answer to. So that's one way to get a conversation going. Of course, if the conversation is, if you're having unbalanced participation, or if not all students are participating, make sure you're considering the challenge level, making sure the discussion questions are at the right level, that they're not too easy or hard that would cause some students to disengage. There are a lot of questions, if they're structured well and open-ended, there's a lot of different ways you can go at those questions, and that helps to make them more interesting. Do the questions that you're asking support a lot of different points of view? The other thing you can do for some students who are not immediate processing type students, right? Some people need time to think about what they want to say or what they think about things. You can support those students by front loading what you're going to be doing. For example, you could tell those students, or I think it's actually helpful to do this with all students. You can tell them, like, the day before, we're going to be talking about this image. Take it home and look at it and see what you think. Tomorrow, when we are discussing it, I hope that you'll share one thing that you noticed, or you'll share one question you have about it. So prime them to be able to participate the next day. You can also, it could be stressful to speak up in front of a group of other, 30 other students, or 25 or whatever is your class size. Another option is to start with pair shares or smaller group conversations, something that takes a little bit of the audience effect out of the conversation. Yet more ways of jumpstarting a conversation is pre-writing something. So you could ask a question like some of those that I've already discussed, like, what's one detail that you notice, and ask students to write it down first. It could even be a one-word answer, but something, or for students who are in the lower elementary grades, they could draw a picture or do a sketch of it, but something that gets them thinking about the image in advance of the discussion. And then, of course, inviting new students who haven't said anything yet to comment without singling anybody out helps to also balance out participation. Okay, what if there's a lot of off-topic comments? That happens sometimes in discussions that I've led, right? Maybe one student starts talking about, I don't know, things like video games seem to come up a lot, right? So sometimes it can be on topic. It seems like it's off topic. I've been looking at works of art and I'm asking, what details do you see? And somebody says Transformers. And then I delve and I realize, oh, actually there's something in this painting that kind of looks like a transformer. And that's why the student is saying it, and it actually is connected. So also you can delve a little bit to determine if it really is connected, if their comments are connected or not, and ask them to connect it for you. Okay, so that's a kind of an overview of approaches you can use for discussing works of art. This is something that we do a lot at the Getty. For those of you who have participated most recently in our virtual art exploration program, and those of you who have participated in our field trip program, our teaching style is very dialogue, discussion based. And so we use these approaches with students all the time, pretty much. They're pretty much discussion is the main approach that we use for exploring works of art. And we find that students of all ages are really able to do this. Even the youngest, who you might think aren't ready to look at a work of art, when asked the right questions and asked to engage in the right way, can really have discussions about works of art. They might be shorter, but they can really engage too. So with that, we're going to take a look at all the wonderful questions that you have all shared with us in the Q&A, and we'll see how many we have time to answer, realizing that we're a little low on time. And I'm looking at the questions, and some of them, there was a question about what aspects are doable within lower elementary grades. And I think we've talked a little bit about that. There's a question about students not knowing what to say. So hopefully by talking about using icebreakers and starting with simpler questions to kind of break the ice and get students comfortable with looking at works of art and noticing things, hopefully that helps. And then there's a question also about how you wrap, like, when are you done, essentially? When does a discussion end? And so I think that would depend on what your goals are, how you're using that work of art. The discussion might be a piece of a broader, broader activity that's going to culminate in an art project or a writing activity or something more. So the discussion feeds into your broader lesson. And then some of the more specific questions, I think, I agree. We can either ask participants to email us for a deeper answer at teacherprograms@getty.edu, or take them to the discussion groups that will be following on the webinar.
Awesome. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and button it up then. All right, so thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you found this webinar useful and that you'll join us again for our next webinar in the series. All right, thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you again at future Getty webinars. Have a great time.